Something unparalleled happens in Torah this week. We leave the Israelite camp. We leave it behind, and our focus shifts. We're invited into new territories to encounter new characters. We meet, as Rabbi Berman said, Balak, king of Moab and all of the Moabite people. Balak has watched as the Israelites swallow up nation and nation, one after the other, each greater than the Moabite kingdom itself. And Balak grows fearful. And to his credit, he realizes that this is not a war that you win through military might. So rather than trusting his army, he seeks out a prophet of Adonai who can intercede on his behalf. Balak summons this prophet, and he asks this prophet of God to curse the Israelites. The prophet is unable to do anything but what God instructs. So instead of cursing the Israelites like King Balak desires, the prophet blesses the Israelite camp. Three times this comical scene plays out. Balak asks for a curse. The prophet blesses. Balak gets angry. And then we try it all over again, expecting different results, which the saying goes is the definition of exactly right. The Parsha concludes after this third round when the prophet returns home, leaving King Balak disappointed, furious, and staring into the same worrisome future that he faced at the very beginning of the story. So what is this narrative all about? Many of our communities read these verses feeling smug. The enemy is helpless before our God. Look how silly this foreign king is. And yet, is that really what we are meant to understand? Does Torah take us into the Moabite nation in order to gloat? Let's assume that if Balak is given the role of protagonist for this moment of Torah, we're meant to put ourselves in his shoes. He becomes the stand-in for all of us in the story. And so with that mindset, we can return to the question about why this threefold repetition where Balak asks God to curse the Israelites, and instead God's prophet blesses them. Because if the point was for Balak to learn that he was helpless before God, once through that cycle would have done the trick. But instead, the scene replays itself in triplicate. It's as if God insists on the repetition. So why? The answer, I think, is quite simple. Perhaps by continually showing Balak, time and time again, that Adonai can and will bless an entire nation. God is hoping that Balak will come to realize that rather than asking God to curse the Israelites, he ought to ask God to bless his own people. Therein lies Balak's failure and, if we're honest with ourselves, so often our own. Balak's inclination is to curse Israel rather than pray for Moab. This is a very human error. When we find ourselves in situations that feel threatening, tend to try to curse that perceived threat rather than shore ourselves up. And by imparting this story in this way, Torah is asking us to identify this impulse within us and try to overcome it. The sentiment is captured in an old Yiddish proverb. Besser sich zu wünschen, eder jenem zu schelten. Better to pray for oneself than curse another. But even in the original Yiddish, it's easier said than done. We are hardwired to curse others rather than doing the harder work of blessing ourselves. So, what does it take to overcome this inclination? I think a very large shift in a mindset. It requires that we recognize that blessings are not zero-sum game. We have to believe that my being blessed does not rely on you being cursed. Moreover, it requires that we decide that strengthening ourselves is worth more to us than tearing others down. So often in politics, in business, in workplaces, even within our own families, our instinct is to reach to curse rather than strengthen ourselves. And yet if I'm facing a business competitor, am I better served by defaming their product or strengthening my own? If I run for office, am I truly a better candidate if I engage in smear campaigns or if I hone and speak my message? If a Supreme Court decision doesn't go the way I hoped it would, am I better off lobbying insults into the Facebook void or doing the difficult work of organizing and bolstering an outcome I hope to see? If I work on a team and someone on that team succeeds, shall I view them as a threat and try to undermine them with others? Or am I and the team better served by trying to raise myself up to that level? So often, there is short-term gain in cursing rather than blessing ourselves. And so aside from just our knee-jerk reaction to curse, this often cements our decision because cursing, if we're honest, can be very effective. We might even succeed for a time, leaning into our tendency to curse. But in the long run, we are almost always better off choosing to seek our own blessings. I wonder what could have been if Balak had summoned the prophet of God and asked for a blessing from God for the Moabites, his people. Maybe in asking for strength or courage or help or fortitude or whatever it was he felt his people needed, Balak might have realized exactly what his people desired and required in that moment, and then he could have gone to go make that real for them. But instead, he jumped to believe that his best defense was to curse his enemy. And the irony of it all is that Israel was never a threat to Balak and the Moabites. We find out in Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, that God had actually commanded Moses to leave the Moabites alone. But Balak's antagonism of them turns them from friend to foe. Balak could have found an ally in Israel had he been ready to seek out his own blessing alongside Israel's blessing. But instead, by choosing to curse them, he is left isolated. And that is, in the end, the primary difference. Those who choose to follow the inclination to curse others will at best isolate themselves, and at worst, turn everyone around them into an enemy. Those who curb the inclination and choose to seek their own blessing will typically find themselves with allies, even now and then a friend. But like so many sections of Torah, we are invited to inhabit a wonderfully complex situation, to sit in someone's shoes, even in this case, a perceived enemy. And Torah confronts us with the question the Torah confronts Balak. Who do you want to be? A king of curses or a prophet of blessing?